My name is Ben Shankman. This is the uh, chef session on moving from shu to ha. Subtitle: Don't sweat the small stuff. Right now, we're probably all wondering what the small stuff is versus the big stuff as we're moving into a complicated new way of working. But maybe this will help some people. Just to give myself an introduction and give you some background on me. I have a pretty extensive background in project and program management, as well as a good few years of purely Agile experience. I did recently receive my MBA from West Texas A&M with a concentration in computer information systems. And I've worked in a bunch of different industries, but primarily in aerospace engineering, and now I'm in financial services. My current role is a release train engineer, which is kind of like a program level Scrum Master in a scaled Agile framework world. So if you're familiar with an RTE, then you know what that does. If you're not, program level Scrum Master facilitates the large events for the program, make sure that the whole group is moving along. Same kinds of activities that a Scrum Master does, just on a different scale. So Scrum of Scrums, those kinds of next level up coordinations. Number of certifications, all of that you can review at your leisure if you're interested, and feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Always happy for more connections, and especially as it's a little harder to reach out and get people nowadays. Now, what's the goal of this session? I want to get us a better understanding of how we should move towards a mindful Agile practice. This is especially important as we have new teams, that whole forming and storming before you get to norming. We want to know how to move the needle from kind of that foundational practice onward. I do have a quick working agreement for this session. We all love working agreements, right? It gives us an idea of how we stand. Please feel free to interrupt at any point. It's a little harder now, but Jen is going to be monitoring the chat window. So just pop a question up at any point. I will be stopping regularly to ask questions or get feedback from the audience. So please prepare to engage. I know it's a little harder. I think we have a small enough crowd that you can feel free to unmute and ask and give feedback when I'm prompting. If you have a question in the middle of me speaking, please put it in the chat window. Add your commentary as appropriate, but it's not about grandstanding. This session isn't about what an amazing or not amazing Scrum Master RTE that I am, or the same for anyone else. I want people to share their experiences as appropriate to help other people learn. If at any point I go on too long on any one topic, feel free to pop a hand up virtually and give us a fast forward or an enough let's move on already, Elmo. And then I will be respecting the time box. We have a 45-minute session period. I will try to keep the slides to a maximum of 30 minutes, even with interaction, and then leave some discussion at the end. So this will not be a session theoretically that goes right to the end. So you'll have plenty of time to figure out where you're going next. Any questions on the working agreement or additions? All right. So want to talk about the concept of shuhari, or we normally hear it as shu, ha, and ri. So roughly it translates into to keep, to fall, and to break away. Now, this is really more of a martial arts technique or practice. Often it's seen in the Japanese art of Aikido. It's come into common parlance within Agile because what it is, it's understanding the conceptual route to mastery. Now, I will say there is a little bit of a disagreement in the community whether or not shuhari is appropriate for Agile practice, because many consider Scrum or Agile or any of these frameworks to be a masterless practice. I will say that master is in the name for the role that most of the people are who are coaching teams. We've got Scrum Masters. If you're a Kanban leader, you may be doing something like that. So I would say it's not a truly masterless practice, but we are always in search of mastery. We're not masters that are teaching in many cases. So it's a little bit of both. So just to be clear, I like to note when there's a little bit of friction in the community as far as concepts. So I just thought to make sure that everyone's aware of that. Overall, Shuhari is a very widely accepted conceptual practice for Agile, and you'll get to see why. So each of these characters, so Shu is to protect or obey, Ha is to detach or digress, and then Ri is to leave or to separate, right? So let's start with Shu, okay? So Shu is obey. You want to learn the rules, right? Why do we learn the rules? We learn the rules because we need to have some sort of consistent practice. Whenever we start something new, we're probably going to fail at least once. Even if we have a number of successes, at some point you're going to find yourself in a situation where your string of successes has led unintentionally to some kind of failure. And that's why you want a very strong and consistent foundational practice to lean on when you're talking about Agile principles and concepts and framework. And just to be clear, we want people to fail, not in some sort of grandiose way, but failure is part of the learning process. And if you're not failing, you're probably doing something wrong. If you're just starting out with your Agile practice and you're not trying new things and checking and adjusting and having some small failures, then maybe you're not kind of pushing the envelope on things. This is where I'm going to ask for my first piece of participant feedback. Is there any common thing that you can say that you or your teams do by rote, meaning just because you're supposed to do it, whether or not you really know why you do it? Anything in the window, Jen?
We have one comment. She says, not currently, but used to have weekly status meetings.
Okay, that's a great example, not just because it's something that we do just because we're supposed to, but because it's something that we've tried to kind of, you generally try to do away with those in an Agile world when you're talking about those principles, because for the most part, why do you do a daily status, a weekly status report? It's because someone's asked you to do it, not necessarily because it provides any value. In any given framework, Shu is we do it because we're supposed to obey the rules. So exactly, a weekly status report, if you're doing it, is probably because someone's told you to do it, whether or not you know why or what value it's creating. Now, the thing we have to be careful about when we're talking about following the rules or obeying the rules is you can really quickly lean over into starting to practice what many people are calling zombie Scrum. Zombie Scrum being, we just do these things because we're supposed to do them, not because we think there's any inherent value in it, not because we're getting improvement out of it, but because we're supposed to do it. We have our daily stand-ups because that's what you're supposed to do. We keep it to 15 minutes because that's what we're supposed to do. And so on and so forth through a lot of these events. You have to be very careful, because if all you're doing is obeying the rules, then you're going to fall potentially into a pattern where the rules aren't actually doing anything for you. The intention of having a good foundational practice is so that you can start looking at why those things are good and what things are working or aren't working, and move towards that mindful practice. So I just want to caution everyone here that zombie Scrum or Agile in general is something to be very, very wary of, because it's really easy for teams to think we're doing this really well. We're following all of the cadences. We're doing all of the events. We've got all of these ceremonies down pat. But in the end, they're not getting anything out of it. And that's really where you want to start looking at, are we starting to be a bit of a zombie? And then maybe try to go back to looking at the rules and moving towards a mindful practice, getting towards that ha instead of just the Shu.
We do have a comment kind of related to what you just said.
Sure.
People thinking, why are we wasting time on retros? We can't solve these problems anyway.
Oh, so I love that. And that sounds like a quote directly from someone who has heard that from in the room of a retro. That's a very, very, very good comment. we have that come up a lot. We can't solve these problems anyway, so why do we bother doing that? And a lot of those times, exactly, it's because we're following this retrospective format, but we're not doing anything that comes out of it. We're asking 3 questions. We're saying what went well, what went poorly, what could we have done better, where were we blocked? And then out of that, you document some things, and then we're done with the retro. Let's move on to the next sprint. And nothing happens. So no one sees any progress. No one gets any continuous improvement. So you get those questions. Why are we even doing that? When someone asks that question, you absolutely should remember this picture and wonder, are we just kind of zombie marching our way through this and no one's seeing the value because we're not getting any value out of it? Absolutely great comment. So now let's talk about ha. All right. Ha is to detach or to break away. So it's bending the rules. Some people think that ha is where you start to break the rules. And I don't like to think of it as breaking, because when you're moving from shu to ha, it's really important to not just immediately start breaking the rules. All right. Breaking the rules means we're going to start disregarding some things instead of just changing. Again, I think of ha as a mindful change. Breaking may be mindful, but in some cases, breaking may just be throwing things out, in which case that's another thing to be cautious of. But once you have your good baseline practice, you should start looking at where are we not getting benefit out of what we've been sold as a framework that's supposed to help make us better. Right? You can break the rules, but you need to make sure you're doing it thoughtfully and intentionally, okay? So now that we're talking about ha, and we're talking about bending the rules, making small changes, what's the small stuff? So again, let's reach out to the audience. Can you give me an idea of something that you think in your practice, maybe this is something that you've done, maybe this is something you're thinking about doing, something that you think could or should be bent or broken from a practice perspective?
I'll just remind
Hi,
the,
Ben.
oh,
Oh,
go
sorry.
ahead.
This is James speaking. Um, one of the things that as a developer has occurred to me that could use bending or breaking is the amount of specifics that go into writing tasks for in an agile environment. So we're encouraged to write them as very, very generic and just sort of user stories and so on, but not mention specific technologies and how we want to actually implement those stories.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I think could be bent or broken is actually adding some specifics and guidance for developers on how to implement the user story or the task or the update or whatever it is.
Yeah, I think that's great. So to put that in the more generic context, we're given a story format, user stories. And for the record, Scrum as a framework doesn't mandate the user story format. That's something that's just come together as that confluence of Scrum, extreme programming, and the history of that. User stories have just kind of been taken into Scrum as this is just how we're going to write our stories, because it's a great format. But James is exactly right. Sometimes the format isn't appropriate. Maybe as a persona, I want to be able to do this functionality so that I can gain this benefit. That's great. But then you really do get into the point where you need to break that work down for the team to be able to do. So if you have a product owner who's writing a story and it's from a business value perspective, they may do that. But then once you get into the nitty gritty of breaking that story into tasks within a sprint to do, why wouldn't you use specifics? Because that's going to help the team do the work. And if that's going to help the team do the work and help the team do it better, and they're not doing it exactly like another team is doing it, I think that's great. Exactly. You can bend or break this rule that a lot of teams like hold really sacrosanct. You must write your stories in this format or it's not a story. And I agree with you, James. I don't think that that's a rule to hold on to. You know, that's not the hill you want to die on. So great example. Any other examples from anyone?
I don't see anything in the chat.
Okay. I'll give one more. Many teams are addicted to 3 questions, whether you're talking about the stand-up or you're talking about the retrospective. You know, it's the daily stand-up is what did I accomplish in pursuit of the sprint goal yesterday? What am I going to do today in pursuit of the sprint goal? And where do I need help? Where am I blocked? Those are good questions, but that's really rote. Like when we start out, we're going to ask these because the team needs to understand that it's not a status meeting. It's not a status report. I don't want people thinking that as a Scrum Master, they need to report to me on something. I want them to talk to the team about what they're going to do, what they need help with. And one of the first things that I think should be bent or broken when it comes to your daily stand-ups is moving outside of this 3-question format if it's not working for your team. If it keeps you focused, keep it. If it's making people force themselves into this kind of mindset that isn't good for the team, get rid of it. Are you having a daily stand-up? Are you keeping it within 15 minutes? Are you making sure that the team has alignment on what they're doing? I didn't realize I had a transition in there. Then I think that's the most important thing. And the same thing with retros. You know, first thing you should do is once you do a couple retros with your what went well, what could have gone better, start thinking about different formats. There are entire books on how to hold retrospectives that I think a lot of people aren't necessarily familiar with.
Ben, I'll say that at least a 1/6 of the room was nodding along with you as you were saying that we always use the same 3 questions. We're addicted to that. And I think something you said, they work fine for us, but I think that's a good thing to kind of challenge. I don't know if different questions could help us more, and we just don't know it.
Yeah, just as an example, I've done this actually 2 or 3 times with different teams now. We don't ask 3 questions. If we have a number of retrospectives and it turns out that we have a consistent theme, we'll dedicate an entire retrospective or even have a longer session to do some real problem solving and do like real root cause analysis. You know, Scrum is grounded in empirical principles, and root cause analysis is a big part of Lean and Agile principles. So take your common problem that's reoccurring and do a deeper dive into how you can come up with some ideas to solve it. And then that becomes your retrospective with some really concrete activities that come out of it for the team to add to the backlog. So this is all great when people want to change small things, but what happens when people want to do big things? You know, we have a lot of people that maybe say, oh, we don't have time for sprint reviews. We don't have time for demos. We definitely don't have time for retrospectives. We have enough of a time making sure we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, let alone doing continuous improvement. So what do we do when people want to not just bend the rules, they want to just whole cloth throw big things out? And especially in this time, I would say, don't panic. The most important thing that you can do when people want to make changes, even big or small, is ask why. Because there may be a very valid reason that people think that we shouldn't be doing this. I think it's our job as facilitators, as leaders, because we're servant leaders. How can we make sure that the team understands what value we're trying to get? And if the format that people are expecting isn't working, how do we make that more valuable or more apparent, or actually move people or lead people down the path of doing the things that will help their process without bogging them down in things that they feel are unnecessary? So instead of clinging desperately to a framework, ask why and collaborate on a solution. I think it's important that we don't just hold on to these things again as sacrosanct, as inviolable. Sometimes things need to change because the way that your company, your team is doing business necessitates moving it a little bit differently. So ask why, and then collaborate on something that hits the core of the value that this is supposed to bring without compromising on things like continuous improvement, keeping the teams working while not wasting their time on non-value added things like status reporting, that kind of thing. So how do we work on this? How do you handle requests for change? Again, let's get some feedback from the audience. Who's gotten a request to change any one of these things? And you don't have to be too specific, but if you want to share, what have you been asked to change? Have you been asked to change your stand-ups, demos, retrospectives? And how did you handle that? Anybody?
I'll just remind the group that because we're small, feel free to unmute if you want to shout out. I'll share a comment I think that answers the question sort of. I guess it falls under planning, but on our team, right or wrong, for years, the developers wrote our test cases. And because they were, anyway, I won't go into the history. And at one point it was decided that the BA should write the test cases, and our BAs had never done that before. So we instituted this whole process, which made a lot more, it just tipped the whole balance of where the front end work for Rally kind of happens. And that was a year and 2 months ago that we started that effort. And it's not been without some pain points, but it's been a really interesting process.
Great. Yeah, and again, it's why do we want it? Again, sorry about the transitions. Why do we want to do these things? We want to make these changes because maybe in that case, the team really needed the help. They wanted to do more development, and the BAs had capacity to do things like write test cases. And so we enable that even though it's outside of what's currently our process. And so you ask why, and then you come up with something that works, and then you try it. And then if it doesn't work, you change it again. That's the nice thing about this. As you make mindful change, ideally you do it in a small way, and then you look at it, examine it, keep it as part of your retrospective and say, how did this go? Okay, great. Let's keep it, let's change it, let's trash it and try something else.
We have an interesting comment from Chad. He says, I've been asked by a new CTO to drop stand-up, drop sprint review and retro, and drop estimates and sprint planning completely.
Wow. Chad, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, I mean, let me give you a little bit more detail. So on my project, right, I was the Scrum Master for several years, and the client consistently wanted more features, more value than they were getting for what they were paying. And it's a testament that we lasted 3 years. But then they finally hired a new CTO, and he's like, you know what? I'm not going to listen to anything you say. You're going to do it this way. I don't care how long you think it's going to take. I don't care that you want designs. Here's the requirements. Go get it done. I'll see you in 3 months. And it's like at that point, it's like I kind of shrug. It's like, well, I tell you things, but you don't hear them. And that's our planning process. So like, yeah. What do? You just let go. And that's the last one, right? Raw. Just like let go, I think.
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about stages of grief, we do eventually have to let go of things. But I will say one thing that you could think about is, how can I implement some things within the daily process that eliminate the need for stand-ups? I mean, it's hard to think about that because the stand-up serves a very valid purpose. But I've had people say, I don't do daily stand-ups with my team because they're so in each other's pockets. We're doing pair programming. Everyone knows what everyone else is doing. They're very active on the Scrum board. So a daily stand-up in many cases is really redundant. We get it done in 5 minutes. And my answer to that is fine, then have the stand-up and have it last 5 minutes. But if you have someone from way above who is a very old school mindset on just get it done in 3 months, sometimes you may have to actively integrate things like that into the day so that you can still get the benefit without it necessarily appearing that you're wasting the time on these things that someone doesn't see as value added. So, you know, my brother, who's a Scrum Master too, he might call it, he calls it guerrilla Scrum. You know, you kind of just do it in the background and get some benefit out of it while you don't necessarily have a lot of buy-in. So you got Chad, I'd love to hook up with you offline to talk about that situation more, because it's very interesting, the situation that you're in. And if there's anything that I could do to help, I'd love to. But I think, unfortunately, there's more to unpack there than we have in the rest of the session.
Yeah. Sounds good. Yeah, talk later for sure. Thanks.
So let's talk about the bottom line, because a lot of the requests we get for change, you have to look at it. And this comes from Henrik Nyberg's Scrum checklist. And however it is we share these slides later, there's a link to it. It's an oldie, but a goodie. It's one of my favorites. And the 3 things that he recommended, that if your team is doing these things, then you probably don't need to adjust your process too much. Are we delivering working and tested software, or whatever product you're delivering, because Scrum isn't just for software, in every 4 weeks or less? Are you delivering what the business needs most? And are you continuously improving your process? If you're doing those 3 things, your process isn't inherently broken. And I don't know that you need to have a lot of heartburn on trying to force fit what you're doing into any given framework. But if you're not doing these things, if you're not producing regularly shippable increments of work, if you're not actually delivering business value, if you're delivering work, but you're not delivering what people want, and if you're not continuously improving, then that's what these frameworks are meant to do. They're really meant to help with that. So again, mindful change means if you look at the framework and you say, are we doing these things? If yes, then maybe we make some small mindful change. And if not, you know, then maybe a little more systemic, but you get the idea. When you're asking why we're doing something and you look at what your team is doing, and if they're hitting the bottom line, maybe be gentle with them, because the team's doing something right. If you're doing these things, these 3 things, you're obviously doing something right, because you're delivering value that the business wants and you're improving your process. But moving from shu to ha, that's really if we're stuck just doing things because we're supposed to be doing them, how do we get to the point where we're doing things because we were making mindful changes to do them better? And for the record, re is being the rule, and we don't need the rules because we're kind of embodying the principles and making decisions based on what this is meant to do. This session isn't about re. We could do another session on that maybe next Nerd Summit, but that's why we're talking about ha. This is really, I think, where most teams should be right now, unless you've been practicing Agile and Scrum for a really long time. But in my experience with the people that I've worked with, most people are kind of struggling between getting from shu to ha, which is why I put this session together. But don't discount what the team is doing. If it's doing these 3 things, then they're doing something very well. It's just a question of looking at what they're doing versus what in your head you think the framework should be having them do. So that's all I had for content, which is great because we're at the half-past mark. So this is a good time to have some open discussion or Q&A if people have any questions for me about this topic.
Hi, this is James again. I did have a question for you, actually. How do you handle siloed groups best in this kind of environment? So, for example, I'm working with a design group, and the design group is completely siloed and self-managing, and they do the design work and sort of pass it off, or ideally they do the design work and pass it off and we take it and implement certain things. But that's of course not how it works. There's a ton of work that has to be done between the two of us, and their work structure and tools are completely different than ours. So how would you sort of integrate those processes or adapt in the situation where we can't really change our tools and they won't change theirs?
That's a really good question. Quick follow-up question. Are they working in any Agile framework, or are they kind of either standard waterfallish or nothing really?
I think it's the attempt at a Agile framework.
Okay, so like we're somewhere between Scrum or Fall and something else.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they have
Okay.
scrums and they have certain deliverables that come through at certain times, but I'm in terms of actual processes, I'm not sure what they follow.
Okay, but they have a daily stand-up.
I'm not sure.
Okay,
So this yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry. So first question that you might want to find out is do they have a daily stand-up? So I work a lot with in SAFe. They're called component teams. So this is teams that represent, we're supposed to be doing work in a vertical slice of the horizontal pieces, but in many cases, some companies have taken these horizontal slices and moved them elsewhere. You may have, like you said, a totally separate design group where design would normally be part of that stack. So what do we do when someone's taken a slice of our cake and put it over here where we don't really have a lot of access to it? That's why I said the first question might be, do they have a daily stand-up? We don't want to invade people's stand-ups, but theoretically, if they're having a stand-up and they're following anything like Agile principles, people should be able to attend as observers, especially if your team is dependent on something that their team is producing or vice versa. In many cases, we may have teams where you have a BA who is attending other teams' daily stand-ups to make sure that if there's any questions that come up during the 15-minute stand-up, they can be there for a stay after, where they can be there to answer questions for that other team. In some cases, you may want to talk about, can you implement a scrum of scrums? If you have a daily stand-up and they have a daily stand-up, can the two Scrum Masters get together and talk about what the teams are doing, where the work is interfacing, not interfacing, how they're looking as far as their expected delivery time, that kind of stuff. So I would start with seeing whether or not you can open more lines of communication. Again, use the framework, use the principles that we want to use, but then again, start thinking about, okay, we've got two separate teams. What would I normally do? Well, in this case, if I wanted those two teams to have enough connection, either we have to link them a little bit higher, or you have to have some sort of like intermingling. So you could start with those things and see how much that got you.
Okay. Just to be clear, they do exceptional work, and they certainly provide everything we need and so on. I was just wondering how to increase the lines of communication, and maybe having an observer for a stand-up is a way to do that.
Yep, that might be.
Thank you.
I have something I'm thinking about, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to say it perfectly, but I think there's I'm curious, like just trying to get your thoughts if anything comes to mind with, like, so if you think about, shu ha ri, and in the shu stage you're getting the fundamentals down, right, and following the rules. But this thing happens, as teams are trying to mature, trying to find their way, where it's almost like Scrum or whatever the framework is, or whatever, for a lot of people that are trying to help the whole thing, like becomes the new rule book. Like how, I don't know if there's a question in there, but like,
no, I hear your. Can I try and reframe your question so
yeah.
you know if I'm getting it? So when we choose a framework and we're implementing that, I know some people hate the word implementing, but we've chosen a framework and we want to live by some principles, but we essentially get handed this rule book of thou shalt do these things. That then again, how do you get people to understand the value that's supposed to be associated with these things instead of just following the rules? Is that where you were going?
Yeah, I guess, right. Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I guess I'm wondering, like, and I've heard you say this before, like the why gets skipped over.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like sometimes in those scenarios where, you know, the why we do these things gets skipped, and you just do, and now I'm tying this back to other parts in your talk, so maybe you did cover this a little bit, where it's like we're doing it just to do it.
Yeah, but we could talk more about this. I mean,
Yeah.
the thing that I think a lot of teams, so this is where I think my approach to being a Scrum Master is different than some others. Not all Scrum Masters do things the same way, and this is where if you have a new team, and again when you're forming and you're definitely storming, the Scrum Master really has to play a very active role. That doesn't mean that the Scrum Master is anyone's manager. That doesn't mean that the Scrum Master is some sort of rules lawyer. The Scrum Master is the one who's supposed to help the team to understand the why. The team isn't going to just figure this out on their own. And it's really the Scrum Master or Kanban leader or Agile project manager, or whatever it is your company calls it. It's that person's part of their role is to lead the team to the understanding of why they're doing these things. I did a lot of this with a number of forming teams is, you know, the team may not ask you why. The team may just follow the rule book, but you may still want to tell them why. You may want to tell them why like 17 times, because supposedly that's the number that science tells us is the number of times you have to hear something before you start internalizing it.
Interesting.
Why we're doing this thing. You know, before we would start a daily scrum, I might open it up with, all right, team, we're going to get our daily stand-up started. And then just to
think we lost
Thanks for
Ben
saying
a
something.
minute.
I
Yeah, I
couldn't tell
know.
if that was me or
Yeah, something on Ben's end, I think.
oh no.
We almost made it.
Hey,
sorry,
back.
and I'm back. So yeah, I'm not sure where I left off, but the team will do this less, like need that feedback as they just start doing what they need to get the value out of it instead of being led to doing it that way. So I think the things you're talking about, if you have a Scrum Master who's going to take a very step back and I'm going to let the team approach me with questions on the Agile frameworks, that's, I think, more of a mature stance than you can really take with a new team. Because again, you have to teach people before you can make sure that they understand it so that they can do it themselves without needing to be taught. So sorry I dropped out there for a second.
I'm glad you got back.
Yeah, so we've got, what, 5 minutes left? Does anyone have any other questions or things we want to talk through?
I don't have anything in the chat channel.
Okay, great. And I see we still have 10 participants, so that's nice. That means that we at least engage people through that. And nice to see you, Kelly.
Yeah, nice to see you. Yeah, I think it got up. I think it got up to 14 or 15 or so.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Jen probably has the count.
And Chad, I don't know if you're still on, but I definitely want to talk to you about that situation you're in. I'm not saying that I've had some experience with some really kind of top-down old school managers coming in and trumping on our Agile process, but I'd like to talk with you about that.
I would like to talk with you about that as well. It could be very therapeutic and
There's an Agile Methods channel in Slack.
Yep.
Could be a great place to continue the conversation.
All right, if there are no other questions, then I think we can end the session. As far as recording goes, I really appreciate both the Nerd Summit folks giving me the opportunity to lead a session, and the participants for joining me. It's been great, and I'm very happy that I had some active participation from the attendees. So thank
Awesome.
you all.
Thank you. Let's do let's do this. Woo!
Yay.
Everyone's on mute.